Hello and welcome to Living with Lions, the Mountain Lion Foundation's monthly webinar series. My name is Gowan Batiste. I am the Coexistence Programs Manager. We are a national not-for-profit organization. Our work is focused on ensuring that mountain lions survive and thrive in the wild. So we do this work in a couple ways. First, we offer proactive, community-based coexistence training and support. That we help people keep themselves, their pets, their livestock safe, while also keeping wildlife safe. And then secondly, we work with institutional partners and with citizens like you all over the US to ensure that protections are in place for mountain lions and their habitats. And then thirdly, we do a lot of educational programming and myth busting to help both institutional decision makers and also average citizens understand just how important cougars are ecologically and how straightforward it can be to coexist with them. With our Living with Lions webinar series, each month we cover a new angle on how people and mountain lions can peacefully coexist. So please, as we are going on, feel free to put your questions into the Q&A as the presentation is happening. It's not disruptive, and we will answer them at the end. I'm so excited for today's talk. Glen Kalisz is the Habitat Connectivity Biologist for the Washington State Department of Transportation. I really wish you were here at the conference with us, where he works to increase the ability of animals to safely navigate the highway system and reduce the frequency of dangerous wildlife vehicle collisions, typically with the aid of wildlife crossing structures. So there's all kinds of work that you do for that, up and down and through the state. Including cameras, using GIS, managing carcass removal, wildlife vehicle collision data, and finding common sense ways to integrate habitat connectivity elements into other aspects of highway management, such as within the purview of fish barrier removal projects, mentoring habitat connectivity interns, and securing funding for future projects and research. So I am so excited about how passionate you are about this. This is a topic that's really near and dear to a lot of our core viewers' hearts as well. Very excited to turn it over to you, Glen.
Great, thanks. I appreciate it. Can you hear me all right and see my screen? I always like to double check. Cool, thank you. Appreciate it. So I'm excited to be here today. My name is Glen Kalisz. I am the Habitat Connectivity Biologist for the Washington State Department of Transportation. I refer to that as WashDOT pretty frequently. And my job involves finding ways to reduce collisions with wildlife and helping animals safely navigate the highway system. And today I'll summarize several ways that WashDOT and partners engage with the field of habitat connectivity. And I like to say that WashDOT takes a two-pronged approach to addressing wildlife habitat connectivity issues along state highways. It's equally important to increase habitat connectivity as it is to reduce those dangerous wildlife vehicle collisions. These are our two primary goals when planning for habitat connectivity investments along state highways, such as building wildlife crossing structures. And habitat connectivity is typically defined as the degree to which the landscape allows animal movements and other ecological flows. And habitat connectivity is essential to healthy wildlife populations because it allows animals to move to place to find food, shelter, and mates. And in a changing climate, it also provides opportunities for migration to more suitable conditions. And especially large-ranging species like cougar need connected habitats, as they often disperse hundreds of miles from natal home ranges to avoid inbreeding. And this simply isn't possible in highly fragmented landscapes. And the reason a state transportation agency employs a habitat connectivity biologist is because roads, and especially major highways, often represent the most daunting barriers to animal movements, fragmenting their habitats and also functioning as sources of mortality via wildlife vehicle collisions. But there are things that we can do to reduce the fragmentations associated with roads and to reduce those wildlife vehicle collisions, like building wildlife crossing structures. And Washington built our first wildlife crossing in 1976 on Interstate 90 just outside North Bend. Saw a few people from that area. Today, we have around 47 wildlife crossing structures, ranging from culverts, like this corrugated steel culvert. This cougar image was taken on Christmas Day, so this is a Christmas cat, apparently, all the way up to giant wildlife overcrossings and undercrossings. But these aren't cheap, easy, or quick solutions. So we have to be deliberate about where we build them. And today I'll discuss how we prioritize the highway system for habitat connectivity investments, and I'll provide a few examples of planning efforts within high priority areas. I'll also touch on how fish barrier removal projects can benefit terrestrial species, and then finish up with several high-level wildlife observations from the Interstate 90 Snoqualmie Pass East Wildlife Crossing Project, where this photo was taken. So starting out, I'll talk a little bit about how we prioritize the highway system. And WashDOT does have a previous highway prioritization framework called the Habitat Connectivity Investment Priorities, but the data informing those are quite old and it's definitely in need of an update. So in the past year and a half or so, we've been partnering with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and several others like Conservation Northwest and multiple tribes to create what's called the Washington Habitat Connectivity Action Plan. And this is a collaborative partnership to prioritize places to protect and enhance habitat connectivity statewide. And from the outset, we've been operating under a few guiding principles in that we want to build from what we already have. Washington has a long history of habitat connectivity science, research, and implementation. And so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We want to lean on what has already been done. And one major benefit of doing that is that it allows us to also support and amplify existing connectivity work. Many tribal governments, local jurisdictions, and state entities have began and are in the middle of connectivity work based on previous prioritization frameworks. And we want to make sure that the overruling action plan supports those projects. This action plan is focused on terrestrial wildlife connectivity. There are plenty of fish passage plans out there, and we don't want to conflict with those. We recognize the strong alignment of both fish and terrestrial wildlife connectivity, and we look for opportunities to benefit all species in the end. But this plan itself is focused on identifying the most important places for terrestrial wildlife in order to maintain or increase connectivity on a statewide scale. And we're identifying both landscape connectivity priorities as well as road crossing priorities. And I'll be discussing the road crossings much more today. But to do so, I have to give you a little bit of information on how the landscape connectivity priorities come together as well. So when it comes to the WHACAP, that's what we call the Washington Habitat Connectivity Action Plan for short, so you don't have to say that many syllables all the time. When it comes to the WHACAP transportation analysis, we have two main objectives that really relate to the two primary products that we're creating with this plan. And the first is that we want to rank every single mile of the highway system for two independent categories related to habitat connectivity. And these categories reflect our two-pronged approach to addressing connectivity issues. They are wildlife-related safety, which is a measure of wildlife vehicle collision potential, and ecological value, which is a measure of biodiversity with a strong emphasis put on connected networks of habitat and the ranges of species of greatest conservation need. And those include threatened and endangered species. So this full highway system ranking is used internally to enhance transportation projects, which I'll discuss quite a bit later when I talk about fish barrier removals and the overlap with terrestrial connectivity planning. But we also want to go from those full highway system rankings to what we call a short list of the most important places statewide that are contiguous stretches of highway longer than 1 mile that have similar characteristics, such as wildlife vehicle collision rates or ecological ecosystems that we're intending to connect, or species assemblages. And this short list is intended to be this focus of standalone wildlife crossing projects that can allow coordinated action across agencies, jurisdictions, tribes, and others. For instance, if we're going to build a wildlife crossing along the highway, we need the Department of Fish and Wildlife and other land management agencies to ensure that the habitat we're intending to connect remains habitat into the foreseeable future, because a wildlife crossing has a lifespan of at least 75 years. And so we have to plan for habitat connectivity both at the road's edge and away from it to really maximize the functionality of these wildlife crossings. So we want to identify that full highway system rankings using 1 mile segments, and then we want the short list of the most important priority zones statewide. And to give you a sense of how that action plan transportation analysis is progressing, I'll use this very busy slide. I just yesterday gave an hour-and-a-half presentation on just this prioritization process. And so I'm trying to condense this down into a very high-level overview, and it gets a little messy. But it begins in the bottom left corner here, where we've modeled ecosystem connectivity for various forest types and shrub steppe habitats in Washington state. These ecosystem connectivity models take the human footprint into account as well, like developments and roads. And then this becomes the base map that we layer additional landscape prioritization criteria on top of. These include things like various species-specific habitat connectivity analyses that have been produced, the ranges of dozens of species of greatest conservation need, protected areas, climate connectivity metrics, so that we can not only identify the most important places today for wildlife crossings, but make sure that those will be functional into the future as habitats shift due to climate change. And then also various quality metrics related to the landscape, like the permeability of the habitat type for various species. All of this information is quantified and attached to this draft ecosystem base map to arrive at those landscape priorities. This info is then used to prioritize the highway system as well. So basically, the prioritized landscape is then attached to the transportation base map, which is the full state highway system, divided into 1 mile long segments. And each of those 1 mile segments receives a numerical score based on their intersection with the prioritized landscape, which also has its own score per unit, basically. Then additional transportation criteria is used to further augment those scores for the 1 mile segments of the highway system, for both the ecological value category, which is a measure of biodiversity, and the wildlife-related safety category, which is a measure of that wildlife vehicle collision potential. And so when we think about the ecological value category, one of the primary additional data elements we include is traffic volume. And the reason we do that, we basically weight the landscape scores by traffic volume, because if you've already identified a high value ecological area or a wildlife corridor, you can think of them like that, and where they cross a highway, then the higher the traffic volume becomes, the more impacted that wildlife corridor is, and the higher the priority it is. And traffic volume can rise to the level of a complete barrier to wildlife movement where nothing is getting across that road. So it's a pretty good indicator of the threat that these corridors are facing due to the road. And then the wildlife-related safety category, it uses tens of thousands of records of wildlife carcass removals and wildlife vehicle collisions collected over a 5-year subset, as well as the locations of human injuries and fatalities related to wildlife vehicle collisions to kind of identify those wildlife vehicle collision hotspots. It's a little more complicated because we do use hotspot analyses to weight these by different species, but I won't get into all of that. The main take-home point here is that this category identifies the areas where we've historically had the worst wildlife vehicle collision issues for a variety of species, though deer are the most commonly hit large animal on our highways. So once we prioritize these base maps, we also use them to further identify that short list of the most important places statewide that can allow coordinated action across jurisdictions, agencies, and other managers. So that's a really quick and dirty way of how we're trying to prioritize the highway system and also the landscape for connectivity in Washington state. And this action plan will be published in June of this year and final draft products. I know that's a little bit of an oxymoron there, but we've gone through a lot of review. We think we're on final products already right now. It's just a matter of writing the actual report and finishing things up. So we hope to have this published by June. But we are already very well aware of a few extremely high priority areas on the statewide scale due to previous analyses, as well as our draft outputs from this current analyses. And I want to address one of those that we are currently investing a lot in as far as the planning phases go, to kind of give you an idea of where we're focusing our efforts currently. And there is a strong Cougar connection here. And this is Interstate 5 in Southwest Washington, and specifically a wildlife crossing structure feasibility study that we're engaged with. And this study took place along 2 areas on I-5. One is just south of Olympia, and the other is kind of in the Castle Rock vicinity, just west of Mount St. Helens, if you're familiar with that area. And these locations were identified through modeling as the last remaining opportunities to connect the iconic Cascade Mountains with Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens to the Willapa Hills and the also iconic Olympic Peninsula with Olympic National Park, coastal rainforests, and just, all sorts of wonderful habitats. Everywhere else in between these two identified corridors has already been too far developed, and the habitat just doesn't remain. And so that's why we consider these the last remaining locations to potentially bridge this major highway barrier. And while these were originally identified through expert-based modeling, they're actually verified and validated by over 100 cougars that were GPS collared by the Olympic Cougar Project on the Olympic Peninsula as the most likely places that cougars would approach I-5 when dispersing from the Olympic Peninsula. And the Olympic Cougar Project is co-led by the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe and Panthera, with membership from five other tribes on the Olympic Peninsula, including the Quinault Indian Nation, the Makah tribe, the Port Gamble and Jamestown S'Klallam tribes, and the Skokomish tribe. And WSDOT has been working with the Olympic Cougar Project for many years, and they've been an incredible partner in identifying these important wildlife corridors and really promoting the message of the need for wildlife crossings on I-5 when much of the land they're interested in is on the Olympic Peninsula because they understand the wide-ranging nature of cougars and other species and the need for large landscape connectivity. And that I-5 is currently a major barrier. So there are no wildlife crossings within these linkage zones currently that are capable of passing the diversity of species in the area. And without safe crossings, I-5 is considered a complete barrier to wildlife movements. And this is due in large part to its high traffic volume. Traffic volume can serve as an indicator for what we call the barrier effect of animals, what they experience when they're encountering busy roads. And many studies believe that 10,000 vehicles per day or greater is generally a complete or near complete barrier to movement for most or all species. Orange, red, and black highway segments on this map meet or exceed that threshold. I-90, Interstate 90, and I-5 exceed this threshold across their entirety, and both highways bisect the state. And in many places, they far exceed this threshold. So without wildlife crossings, animals simply aren't getting across these roads. When the I-90 Snoqualmie Pass East project is complete, which I'll discuss a little bit later, in addition to previously constructed structures, most of I-90 within the Cascade Mountains will have viable wildlife crossing structures from approximately Issaquah to Easton that this circle is kind of indicating, with a few exceptions. But I-5, on the other hand, which is arguably the worst barrier highway in the state, yet has few passable crossing structures, has not received this treatment yet. And if you consider this stretch that I just circled from approximately Olympia, Washington to Vancouver, Washington, where both of those linkage zones, the northern linkage and the southern linkage zone, occur. And if you put yourself in the fish passage mindset, if you're familiar with that, when we prioritize fish passage, we think about how much upstream habitat gain can be had per location. And that's how we determine which projects to tackle first. And if you think of that in that mindset, but in terms of potential habitat gain for terrestrial species, and you do so together with the understanding that all of the Interstate 5 is an impermeable highway barrier to wildlife movement, then providing connectivity across I-5 in this stretch could basically offer the most potential habitat gain of anywhere in the state, because you're effectively connecting millions of acres in the Cascades with millions of acres in what we call the Willapa Hills down here and millions of acres on the Olympic Peninsula. And so there's a lot of benefits at this large landscape level there when thinking about I-5. Otherwise, the Olympic Peninsula and the Willapa Hills will end up functioning more like an ecological island. It's surrounded by water on 3 sides and an impermeable highway barrier on the 4th. And this isn't hyperbole. Recent Washington studies have indicated that cougar populations west of Interstate 5 are becoming genetically isolated from cougars in the rest of the state. And they have the highest inbreeding rates of anywhere in Washington. And the research went so far as to suggest that the interstate was the main feature that was limiting this genetic exchange of cougars. And cougars are one of the most mobile species in the Pacific Northwest. And if they're having issues, population level issues based on this highway's barrier status, it's safe to assume the majority of other species are facing the same issues as well. So once we identified those wildlife corridors, the next step was to determine where within them wildlife crossings would provide the most benefits. Each of these stretches was anywhere from 7 to 10 miles long when measured along the highway. And so we really need to drill down within those to determine the best locations. And this was done with what's called a wildlife crossing structure feasibility study, which was just completed in late November 2024. This was funded by a partner, an NGO named Conservation Northwest. And we worked on this together. And the feasibility study identified optimal locations for wildlife crossings based on biological and ecological data, as well as engineering opportunities and limitations. It includes conceptual designs for wildlife crossings at these identified locations, like the example here, as well as high-level cost estimates for each structure, which this feasibility study is a really important first step in what will surely be a many years long effort to get wildlife crossings built, because we need conceptual designs, we need cost estimates before we can identify and secure both state and federal funding, which will ultimately be required to build wildlife crossings like this, especially on a major interstate that carries 6 to 7 lanes of traffic and up to 70,000 vehicles per day. To support the feasibility study, about a year or two ago, actually it was a few years ago that it really started as a project with the Olympic Cougar project, but a few years ago we increased this effort as far as wildlife camera monitoring goes. We deployed about 80 roadside wildlife cameras within both of these linkages. This map shows proposed wildlife crossing locations in the northern linkage. You can see just south of Olympia. And these smaller dots on top were our camera monitoring locations. This is a similar map for the southern linkage, just outside Castle Rock. And again, smaller dots are our camera locations, or were our camera locations. And this is just to give you an idea of the broad monitoring coverage that we had. And we've been collecting data for a little over a year now. And pairing wildlife detections with wildlife vehicle collision data will really help demonstrate the wildlife crossing needs in this area. When it comes time to submit proposals to find the funding to actually build these things. And based on over 1 year of data of all 80 roadside cameras, a handful of these have been out for several years due to our partnership with the Olympic Cougar project. But based on all of this data together, we're seeing wildlife activity akin to what you might find in a more remote area, rather than adjacent to the busiest highway in our state. From small elk herds on the side of the interstate as traffic zips by, both the northern linkage and the southern linkage, to cougar, black bear cubs, in fact, and of course, many black-tailed deer. If you're familiar with this area, that is no surprise. And all of these photos were taken at proposed wildlife crossing locations, typically within 100 feet of the roadway. So the animals are kind of just already where they need to be, waiting for a safe crossing opportunity. And especially exciting, we are seeing lots of cougars, lots and lots of cougars. Sometimes we document more cougars directly adjacent to the busiest road in our state than some of our long-term monitoring cameras in the Cascade Mountains. And it's because that's a bottleneck where a lot of cougar activity is kind of filtered into this small blast remaining habitat that they can use. But this is particularly exciting given that recent research concerning genetic isolation of cougars. And I often get asked, how do animals know how to find a wildlife crossing structure once they're built? And the answer is we put the wildlife crossings where the animals already are, which we determine through a variety of survey methods such as camera monitoring or partner actions like the Olympic Cougar project deploying GPS collars on over 130 cougars and counting. And what we know is that the cougars are here. They're so close to the interstate that you can even see headlights from passing traffic in the background of this photo right here. What's not here currently are those safe crossing opportunities. And if they were, the wildlife would begin using them almost immediately post-construction. More cougars. I mean, I literally had to take cougar photos out of here because we're documenting so many cougars within this project area, including we just pulled cards from a camera yesterday and got another cougar earlier in February of this year at one of our proposed crossing locations. So WashDOT also partners with Central Washington University to conduct reptile and amphibian surveys within these I-5 linkages because cameras do not detect reptiles and amphibians. Survey locations are again denoted by these smaller dots, and you can see they included most stream crossings and wetlands in the area, of which there are many. This is a wet part of Washington. So this information will be used in all the same ways as the camera data to ensure that we're providing benefits for as many species as possible when we select the location for a wildlife crossing, rather than just focusing on those charismatic megafauna, which I admit, I love them as well. And surveys conducted between March and July of 2024 have documented many species, including rough-skinned newts at a proposed wildlife crossing location, like this one, with you can see I-5 visible in the background there. And we actually also documented a fairly large breeding colony of rough-skinned newts less than a kilometer from this location, which is within the dispersal distance of rough-skinned newts. And so this is likely a young newt dispersing from its breeding ground and currently is being stopped by the interstate. I will say directly on the other side are really great wetlands. And so it wouldn't, I'm sure this little fella wouldn't mind getting there. We've also found western toads, which are a species of greatest conservation need and currently proposed for listing. And satinas, that's what this little alien-looking salamander is. We found all 3 species of garter snakes that are in the area at one project site. This is a common garter snake, redback salamanders, red-legged frogs, and maybe most exciting to me is this one in the middle top here. This is a Dunn's salamander. They're endemic to Washington state, meaning they don't exist anywhere else in the world except Washington. And previously, they had never been documented east of the Kalisz River until these surveys, where we found dun salamanders at several of the sites in the southern linkage zone directly adjacent to I-5. And they're a somewhat rare species. So this is pretty exciting. I love all wildlife. Cougars are probably my favorite animal, but I love the herps, the reptiles, the amphibians, salamanders. So it's all exciting to me. But the duns are particularly exciting. So one final note about Interstate 5 before I move on, and this is always the elephant in the room, and that is funding. Wildlife crossings are not cheap, and paying for them will require a combination of state and federal funding. It will be an uphill battle, but as it stands now, there are several federal grant programs that can cover the lion's share of a wildlife crossing project. But they still typically require state cost sharing between 10 and 20% of the total project cost. So it will require state and federal dollars to build these things. And so the hope is that eventually we will get these things built through federal grants specifically enacted to construct wildlife crossings on major highways. Outside of major standalone projects like Interstate 5 that we're slowly working towards, WashDOT looks for ways to benefit connectivity within existing transportation projects like highway widening and fish barrier removals, the latter of which offers an opportunity to improve connectivity for aquatic and terrestrial species simultaneously. So WashDOT has been informally enhancing fish barrier removal projects to benefit terrestrial wildlife for over a decade, but this practice evolved into a more formal policy around 2017. And back in 2013, after a long, hard-fought battle, the U.S. District Court found that barrier culverts built over the last several decades impeded tribal fishing rights, which were guaranteed hundreds of years ago. And the courts implemented what's called an impermanent injunction requirement. And that requires WashDOT and the state to remove hundreds of barrier culverts by the year 2030 to allow fish passage and to allow tribes to have access to the fishing rights they were guaranteed. So there are a lot of these projects currently happening in Washington and a lot of opportunities to evaluate them and potentially make these barrier culverts for fish not barriers for fish and not barriers for terrestrial wildlife as well. So this is a huge win for salmon, for the tribes, and for all wildlife in our state. And the reason fish passage and terrestrial wildlife connectivity go hand in hand relates to riparian areas. And riparian areas are the transition between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. They comprise a small portion of the landscape, but provide disproportionately important ecosystem functions. It's estimated that over 75% of all terrestrial species in Washington use riparian areas as habitat. And of course, most aquatic and semi-aquatic species depend on them as well because riparian areas directly influence in-stream habitat. Furthermore, because they're often vegetated and in a natural state, they provide natural movement corridors for all manner of wildlife, large and small. And laws and environmental regulations, especially in Washington, often afford riparian areas certain protections from development, which means building wildlife crossings within riparian areas can offer long-term benefits to conservation actions. For these reasons, fish barrier removal projects are wildlife crossing structures just waiting to happen. But we don't make efforts to enhance all fish barrier removal projects, because many occur in areas lacking significant wildlife habitat or wildlife vehicle collision issues. Instead, we use those highway prioritization tools I mentioned to identify roads that intersect wildlife corridors or experience a high frequency of wildlife vehicle collisions. And then we target projects within those areas. So if a fish barrier removal project falls in or adjacent to a high priority 1 mile segment for either of those two categories I described earlier, it automatically triggers a habitat connectivity review and what we call a habitat connectivity memo, which brings with it recommendations to enhance that project to increase the permeability of the highway to terrestrial wildlife species. And habitat connectivity memos involve site visits and desktop reviews, and they take both physical and biological characteristics into account, such as the topography of the landscape, as well as the species reasonably expected to be present at each site. And there are several elements to these recommendations, but structure sizing is the most permanent and the most important, because underpass dimensions can make or break a wildlife crossing, since some species like elk simply will not use undersized structures. They need large open lines of sight to feel comfortable. So for simplicity, we standardized our sizing recommendations to 3 underpass categories based on wildlife suitability. They're described in this table, and I won't go into all the details, but I will mention that through camera monitoring and literature reviews, we've determined that structures meeting medium structured dimensions will be consistently used by all demographics of deer in Washington, as well as most other species in the state, excluding elk. But in places where we don't have elk, a medium structure, which is really a modest size structure, can facilitate movement for all species in the state other than elk, assuming the habitat is present. And a large structure is really only recommended where we do have elk, which is Washington's pickiest common species by far. Grizzly bears, pronghorn, antelope, those are some other species that have similar requirements, but both of them are very rare in this state. And so we're thinking about elk most of the time when we're thinking about large structures. These can be costly, and as the name suggests, much larger than what a typical fish barrier removal project would require. So they can't always be accommodated. But if we do meet the minimum dimensions of a large structure, we are confident that they will function for all species in the state. And then finally, the third category we call stream simulation. And the width of a stream simulation structure is determined by what's called the bank full width of the stream. Essentially, this just means we provide enough room within this structure to allow the stream to meander naturally. But in addition, we recommend at least 6 feet of vertical clearance for wildlife passage at a minimum. And stream simulation structures are typically smaller than what we recommend as medium structures, and we really only revert to them when there's not enough space between the road and the stream channel to achieve that 10 feet of vertical clearance required for a medium structure. You can pick practically anywhere in Washington state and deer are present, and so that's why we kind of default to this medium structure that facilitates movement for deer, if possible. But while these stream simulation structures may not function for deer and elk, they will benefit a whole host of small and medium-sized animals, including some large carnivores. I mean, I've personally seen cougars use fairly small 6-foot diameter culverts originally installed to pass cattle beneath the road on multiple occasions. So stream sim structure can still benefit many, many species. And this is the minimum. Every fish barrier removal we conduct, whether we weigh in with recommendations for terrestrial species or not, will be stream simulation. So there's a lot of benefits there. Another element of a wildlife crossing are wildlife benches, which are just level and traversable paths outside the 2-year flood level that provides a dry crossing all or most of the year. Benches are particularly important for small or water-averse species, since deer and elk will wade upstream in low-gradient systems. In fact, I've seen cougar and bobcat do this as well, ankle deep in a stream. But when wildlife benches are included, most animals prefer to use them as they represent the path of least resistance. And in my mind, if you have an appropriately sized structure, whether it was designed for wildlife or not, adding a wildlife bench is the difference between a standard culvert or bridge and a wildlife underpass. And including a wildlife bench is primarily an act of intentional grading. And in most cases, these do not add cost to the project at all, but provide significant benefits to wildlife. And then when it comes to habitat features at wildlife crossings, native plants and cover, such as woody debris, really facilitates wildlife movements, especially for cryptic carnivores like cougars. And these elements are automatically included in almost every one of our fish passage projects. And it turns out habitat features that benefit salmon benefit terrestrial species too. So there's really not much more we need to worry about in this regard. And then the last thing I'll mention relates to wildlife barrier fencing, which can significantly increase the functionality of a wildlife crossing. But since there's limited funding in the fish passage world and it's pretty hard to justify fencing for fish, we really don't recommend it at this stage. Instead, we track these locations, and since fencing is something that can always be added after the fact with external funding mechanisms, we just kind of make plans to do that where necessary. While structure size and wildlife benches are a must to get right during construction, because we only have one chance to correctly install those elements. So those are the basic elements of the recommendations we make to potentially enhance fish barrier removals for terrestrial wildlife connectivity. And as far as implementation of this policy goes, during our informal policy window, there were 3 locations that received this treatment and served as proof of concept that enhancing fish barriers removals can really benefit terrestrial wildlife. I could give a whole hour-long presentation on any one of these, so I'll just let the images speak for themselves, but these are those 3 original locations. Since 2017, 19 fish barrier removal projects have met or exceeded our minimum recommendations for terrestrial wildlife connectivity, making them fish and wildlife crossing structures. 8 of these were constructed in 2023 and 7 in 2024. So it feels like things are speeding up in this regard. And we expect more of their kind in the coming years, including on State Route 18, which is in King County, not too far from Seattle, Washington, kind of in between Tacoma, Seattle, and North Bend. For those of you that are not from Washington, that may not mean anything. I forgot to set an inset here. But State Route 18 is currently planned to be widened in this area that is kind of known as the Issaquah Alps. Issaquah, Washington is really close by. And it includes Tiger Mountain State Forest, Cougar Mountain Regional Wildland Park, and Squaw Mountain State Forest to the west, and then the 90,000-acre Cedar River watershed to the east that grades into the Cascade Mountains. So it's kind of on the urban fringe, but it's also the beginning of extensive and high-quality wildlife habitat. It's an interesting location. And we've been working with the State Route 18 widening team for a few years now to ensure that when it's complete, the dozen or more fish barriers that will also be removed during this project will provide a diversity of structure sizes for all species in the area, which do include up to elk and cougars. We've seen collared cougars try to cross this road before. And this will lead to the most permeable version of State Route 18 in its existence. If anybody on this call from Washington knows State Route 18, I'm sure you can understand why it's very hard for wildlife to get across that road. It's kind of scary to drive on sometimes even. So things to look forward to there. I'm going to finish up now with 2024 highlights from our Snoqualmie Pass East Wildlife Crossing Project on Interstate 90 in Central Washington. This is kind of our flagship project when it comes to wildlife crossings, and it's received both national and international recognition for its scope and scale. Not only is this project just plain fun to talk about, but it's something that I would like us to aspire to for all of our habitat connectivity work. Is the attention to detail during the comprehensive planning, construction, and monitoring phases is really impressive. And it has spanned over 3 decades. So it's a lot of time to get things right, I guess. But if you're unfamiliar with Snoqualmie Pass East, it's a 15-mile stretch of Interstate 90. This is the same interstate that begins close to Seattle, Washington, and ends in Boston, Massachusetts. It's a major interstate. A lot of people on this call probably have been on a part of I-90. And this is a 15-mile stretch of Interstate 90, about 60 miles outside of Seattle, deep in the Cascade Mountains within a critical wildlife corridor. And when it was time to upgrade this stretch of interstate in the 1990s, many needs were identified related to structural deficiencies, traffic congestion, avalanche danger, and unstable slopes that had to be addressed by highway widening and reconstruction. Importantly and uniquely, providing ecological connectivity and reducing the risk of wildlife vehicle collisions were also included in the purpose and needs of this project, which ultimately led to the inclusion of dozens of wildlife crossing structures within this critical wildlife corridor in the Cascade Mountains. There is a very interesting backstory to this project, and if this interests you at all, I highly recommend watching the movie called Cascades Crossroads. It's free to view on YouTube, it's professionally produced, and it provides a really good background on how this project came to be. And there's also even a sequel called Critter Crossings in the Cascades, which is also free, that kind of gives you the first look at updates post-construction. But today I'm going very light on the background details, so I can really just save time for a slew of wildlife crossing videos from the project area to close things out here. Those are the most fun things for me, and people usually enjoy them as well. So before I get to those, this map gives you an idea of the landscape and the number of wildlife crossings either already built or planned. We are finished with phases 1 and 2 that ends here. Phase 3 is currently under construction. And so we're only halfway finished with this project. These blue lines are all the wildlife crossings that have been installed. And I'll just point out here, if you notice, phase 1 has Ketchulus Lake Reservoir immediately to the south. The water levels go up and draw down, and sometimes there's crossing real estate and sometimes it's water. But if you notice in phase 2, a lot of the wildlife crossings have terrestrial connections on both sides, and that will be important on this next slide. So I'm just pointing it out now. So the first wildlife crossings in this project area were built around 2012, but it wasn't until 2019 when those phase 2 structures I were just pointing out were completed. And that's when the crossings really took off because of those terrestrial connections. Phase 2 included the wildlife overpass and underpass that you can see in this photo, among several other large wildlife crossings. All told, between phases 1 and 2, there are currently 11 large wildlife crossings in about a 7-mile stretch. And at the end of 2024, we surpassed 30,000 all-time safe crossings documented via camera in the project area at these completed structures. And the bulk of those included elk, deer, and coyotes, but we also had some unique crossings as well. In 2024, we also recorded the most crossings in a single year at over 5,500 at the completed structures, and this is several hundred more than last year, driven by a fairly large increase in elk crossings this year in 2024. Collisions within phases 1 and 2 also remain consistently low since those first structures went in, though we did see a slight uptick from last year from 1 recorded wildlife vehicle collision to 2 within the project area. Back in 2023, we witnessed a spike in cougar crossings, going from 1 in all previous years combined to 5 in 2023 alone. This video is from 2023, and it's one of my favorites because you can see the cougar kind of post-holing in the snow as it kind of comfortably walks through, but is otherwise crossing in a pretty relaxed manner. And I think this shows the comfort this cougar has within this human infrastructure that carries an average of 33,000 vehicles per day overhead, double that during peak season. The fact that it's almost 4 a.m. in this video probably contributes to that comfort level. We also started 2024 off with another cougar crossing last January, but we haven't documented another one since then. And this cougar crossed using the same structure as the last video, but during the afternoon rush hour, which might explain that hurried trot a little more. There's a lot of activity happening above its head at the moment. I'm hoping 2025 will be an all-time cougar year, lots of crossings, but if you consider that only 7 miles of the project area is complete and you think about the large home ranges of cougars, there's probably only 2 to 4 potentially cougars overlapping in that area. You know, I'm thinking like a male on each side and maybe a couple overlapping females. So it's really not that surprising to only see 1 or 2 cougar crossings per year as they kind of explore and utilize their very large home ranges. So it's nothing to be concerned about other than I just want to see more cougar videos because they're fun to watch. So we saw a 134% increase in coyote crossings back in 2023 compared to the year previous. And that coincided with a over 100% increase in snowshoe hare crossings as well that same year. In 2024, coyote crossings dropped to more typical levels and snowshoe hare crossings along with them. So I suspect that an abundance of snowshoe hare in 2023 led to increased coyote activity that same year. Coyotes are one of the few species to actually stick around in the winter. You know, we're in the montane environments here and it gets a little harsh. But luckily for us, it affords us these beautiful snowy shots of animals on the overcrossing. And again, this is carrying 33,000 vehicles per day on average beneath it and double that during peak season, which can sometimes be in the winter because there are also ski slopes up here. So there are almost 3,000 elk crossings in 2024 across all completed structures, which is a fairly significant increase from 2023 when we documented just over 2,000 crossings. So things are still going up. And back then, that was the highest in a year at that time, and we've exceeded that. And when you see a crossing video like this with just this giant herd of elk galloping across the overcrossing, it's probably easy to understand how we again exceeded the highest number of elk crossings in a calendar year in 2024. Several underpasses also recorded a lot of elk use, where we frequently see elk grazing, nursing calves, bedding down, sometimes even demonstrating their ownership and immense size by chasing coyotes out of these undercrossings and off of the overcrossings. So the comfort level is high here for a typically wary species like elk. So that's a good sign that they are treating the areas beneath the highway and the areas above the highway as if they were habitats, just like they would deep in the Cascade Mountains. We also saw 1,700 deer crossings in 2024, including all demographics like this doe and tiny little fawn that, you know, probably is touching a wildlife crossing for the first time in its life. This is a modest increase in deer crossings compared to the previous year, but does not represent an all-time high in a calendar year for deer crossings. And we typically see mostly mule deer, but because this project is very near the Cascades Crest, which is kind of the border between black-tailed deer and mule deer ranges, there's a little bit of an overlap, and occasionally you'll get the black-tailed deer in there as well. And really, a black-tailed deer is a subspecies of a mule deer anyway. We also recorded our first black bear crossing just last year. Trail cameras have captured black bear activity near structures, but it wasn't until last year that we finally documented a safe crossing, which is really exciting to see this Bruin kind of lumbering through here. And again, I think this is kind of normal if you think about black bears and how they hibernate and how this is high elevations and covered in snow, you know, 5 to 6 months out of the year. There's not a ton of time or real estate for black bears in the area at the moment. And we've talked to black bear researchers that feel the same way, but still, it was like, why haven't we had a black bear crossing yet? So it's really exciting to see that first one last year, and hopefully we begin to get more of those. And then bobcat crossings remain consistent between 2024 and 2023, where we recorded 19 crossings both years, and just one less at 18 bobcat crossings than the year prior when this video was recorded. All of our recent bobcat crossings occurred at night. We have those thermal videos, and I really enjoy watching this bobcat glide across the snow in the daylight. So kind of cheating and sharing this 2022 video in a 2024 update, but I think it's worth it. And then I always forget it. It reverts to the other side of the crossing, and we get to see the cat coming towards us. So I'm glad I talked long enough for it to automatically happen there. And then finally, when it comes to low mobility species, we have a few highlights from the Snoqualmie Pass East project as well. WashDOT partners with Central Washington University again to conduct low mobility species monitoring here for small mammals, reptiles and amphibians, fish, and macroinvertebrates. These are all species that we're interested in, but camera monitoring do not do a good job at collecting data for. So a few highlights from 2023 include that Cascade golden mantled ground squirrels were captured for the first time in the project area. And they were actually documented using these rock piles and berms that were installed specifically for small animals to use. And the presence of young and old indicated reproduction by the small mammal in the project area. Western toads, again, they are a candidate species for listing. They've been radio tracked, and visual surveys have also documented their use of wildlife underpasses and the overpass at this location. And there's actually a restored wetland to the south end of this overcrossing that western toads have successfully bred in multiple years in a row. And researchers from Central have actually seen toadlets, which are baby toads, emerge from those wetlands and cross the overpass as well. That's one of my favorite stories. And then coastal giant salamanders are utilizing the artificial stream beds within these structures with high fidelity in multiple locations. And what I mean by that is researchers can go back to the same structure, flip almost the same rock, and find the same salamander. And furthermore, they're doing so in densities that are similar to that of adjacent natural habitat, which is really exciting and I think is a testament to the engineers and the designers that created artificial stream channels that so closely mimic these natural stream channels. So the Snoqualmie Pass East project area benefits everything from salamanders and frogs to elk and everything in between. And I really think this project proves that wildlife crossing structures can be designed and constructed to facilitate all manner of wildlife movements. And this project is only halfway finished. Like I said, phase 3 is currently under construction and will include 11 additional wildlife crossings, including a second overpass. And then phase 4, which is projected to start in the next few years, will be the final phase of this project and include an additional 5 wildlife crossings. So there's a lot to look forward to, both in terms of increased connectivity in this critical area, but also all the cool wildlife detections that we get to see and share with others. So I'm really excited about that. I also really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. I've been a fan of the Mountain Lion Foundation for a very long time, and I really just had fun. So thanks for listening. I'm happy to answer questions if there are any, and my contact info is on the screen, so feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much. That was so fantastic. I am seeing thank yous coming in the chat. I love seeing this footage. I know that is everybody's favorite. So we had quite a few questions here.
Sure.
And oh yeah, you know, and also a lot of thank yous.
Cool.
So I think to start with, do you see a difference between wildlife crossings, especially I-5, at night versus in the day? Are animals still avoiding these highways even at night when there's maybe less traffic?
When a wildlife crossing happens, I'll say out of the 130 cougars the Olympic Cougar Project collared, one made it to I-5, actually approached the northern linkage, and it successfully crossed. His name was Floki, the exception to the rule. And he did it in the middle of the night. And I think that's going to be the most common. And even in slightly lower trafficked volume highways that Floki had to cross on his way, like State Route 8, which is probably half as much traffic, also crossed, I remember, in the middle of the night, 2, 3 a.m. I mean, that's part of when they're the most active, but I think I've read studies in the past by people in California, in fact, Paul Byer comes to mind, maybe Kathy Zeller as well, that have basically, I mean, Paul Byer did a lot of research early on, and what he determined is that when a cougar encounters a road for the first time, they will sometimes basically just hunker down and watch that road for hours. And they'll either, if they intend to cross, and they'll either wait till nightfall and however long that will take, and they'll decide to cross or turn back. But there really is, I think, a thought process that goes through the cougar's mind. And it definitely seems like that these species, cougars, carnivores, but really most species are more active in these kind of human habituated environments more often at night because there is less traffic. But as the elk, as you can see, this bull elk in broad daylight on the overcrossing, as they recognize these structures as safe crossing opportunities, over the years, they get much more comfortable. And so they might revert back to their kind of natural dial patterns, like when are they most active during a 24-hour clock. There's a lot of cool research about that too. Like when are animals active away from crossings and when are they active during crossings, and do those things align?
Totally. And so with these new crossings coming in, and you know, so far the cougar adoption is slow, but would you be anticipating seeing more cougars coming from the Olympic Peninsula east, and heading towards where there's an abundant deer population.
Yeah, I think they're going to go both directions when it comes to I-5. We certainly need the cougars east of I-5. We need their genetics to get west of I-5 and kind of increase the genetic diversity over there. But because there is a very high density of cougars on the peninsula, I think I actually saw Cameron Macias on this call, who's done a lot of research for the Olympic Cougar Project, I think on the density specifically. And it seems like there maybe existed a higher density on the peninsula than in some other places in Washington. So we kind of need an outlet there as well. And so I think, can you remind me of the exact question? I got on one of my tangents. I feel like I'm not going to answer it directly.
So the question was about the direction of travel,
Okay,
which I think you did answer. So, you know, we'll have hopefully cougars going both ways, for different reasons, but we certainly, you know, could use more cougars to the east too.
Yep. And we've seen them on cameras on both sides of the highway. Every time I see them on the east side, I'm like, there's those eastern genetics we need. But they are very active from approaching the interstate from both sides of the highway.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a question about funding. Are you anticipating any funding restrictions for these projects coming up?
Well, yeah, and that's, I don't even want to really get into it, but I think everybody knows that the federal grant landscape is changed and is changing. And if you would have asked me this, a couple months ago, I would tell you for the first time in history, federal grants are now eligible to build wildlife crossings with, and we're all really excited about that. And so as it currently stands, that's the case. And we just kind of have to see where things go into the future, how those programs are changed or not. But right now, they still exist. But like with other federal grants, they're being scrutinized and some of that money is on hold. And so that was the goal from the outset, and that's still the goal. But as I think we know, there's just some uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right
So
now.
is the majority of the funding currently coming from the state, or is any of this privately funded? Like I know some of the crossings in Southern California are privately funded.
Right. And I use that as an example all the time as like what we might need to turn to. That has not happened in Washington. It's something that we'd like to do. There have been people that would like to donate. But there are also some restrictions that make private donations a little harder. Just yesterday, somebody said, has anybody ever crowdfunded a wildlife crossing? I said, the Wallace-Annenberg was kind of close in some ways, that's pretty much what happened initially. But not the typical path. But we might need to consider that into the future because really the pathway is you get some money allocated by the state legislature to use as matching funds to apply for these federal grants, which pay for the bulk of things. And that's been kind of the MO, especially if you want to build these kind of at a higher rate than has happened in the past. And that, especially for places like Interstate 5 that will require a standalone wildlife crossing, meaning we can't do anything in the course of another transportation project because nothing's planned right now, that will require federal funding unless there is a way to find private donations to help spur that, which I will say, there's a lot of interest around I-5. There are so many partners and entities working in this location, concerned with this location, that I feel like if that were to happen anywhere in Washington, I-5 and these crossings would be one of those locations that I think could generate excitement.
That's fantastic. So we have a question from an undergraduate geospatial science student interested in the mapping part of the process. So what types of data on cougars would be useful for GIS mapping for wildlife crossing?
Yeah, well, first, I'll just do my normal GIS plug and say GIS is like one of the single most important skills that I personally got. I use it every single day of my life, sometimes for 12 hours a day when we're doing this prioritization work. It's such a powerful tool. The geospatial scientists are really important. And if you become an expert in those, you're going to find jobs in the wildlife fields you want to work in. So when it came to cougars, because the Olympic Cougar Project was collecting all that great data on cougars, and they were intentionally targeting dispersal aged animals so they could see where they actually move when they're leaving their natal home ranges. That created a ton of different data that than people that are going to get master's degrees and doing other work that work for Panthera and other entities within the Olympic Cougar project are able to take that data and kind of extrapolate it and run these simulations and say, like, here's the habitat types that wildlife were using or that cougars were using on the peninsula, and how does that extrapolate to the rest of the state and help us identify cougar corridors. And then those cougar corridor models, based on the empirical data, were one of those species-specific connectivity elements that went into our highway prioritization framework to help us identify those most important corridors kind of statewide. So hopefully that answers the question. But I think when it comes to a large ranging species like a cougar, GPS collar data is kind of the gold standard of spatial data, but you can also do a lot if you're willing to do large scale camera grids like the Olympic Cougar Project is too. But we're talking hundreds of cameras meticulously managed so that you can create models that are kind of accurate. And so
fantastic. So last question, and this is actually a couple of people have asked this, but I'm gonna roll it into one, which is, what is the timeline for a project like this for planning, implementation, construction, to get it done?
Yeah, I'll give you kind of the politician answer that nobody wants, and it really is variable. The Snoqualmie Pass East project, it's half finished. It's been in design and planning for over 30 years. Things have changed since then. I'll give you another example on the opposite end of the spectrum, though. The Stillaguamish tribe, about 2 years ago, received a federal grant under the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program to build a wildlife overcrossing on State Route 20 between Cedro-Woolley and Concrete. And they're currently in design and permitting stages. And this is the first major transportation project the tribe has ever managed. They're really like moving connectivity forward, like pretty much all the tribes in this state are. They're really key players in the connectivity field. But that project, assuming everything goes to plan, is going to take 4 years from when they got funding to when that large overcrossing is built on. It's a 2-lane state highway, so it's a little different than an interstate. But they're really able to expedite that process. So it's possible to go fast. And it really, the hangup is the funding piece. Once you can identify the funding, then you can kind of move full steam ahead. And, there are lag times for environmental permitting and reviews, but typically we're talking months, not years, to get those elements completed. And so it's really the funding that is going to be the slowest part for a project like I-5.
Fantastic. Well, Glenn, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I hope to look you up when we're in North Bend this summer.
Yeah.
Would love to get together and see some of this stuff.
For sure.
I really appreciate your time and cool presentation. And thank you everyone for spending your lunch hour with us. You are going to get a recording of this. And for everybody who couldn't make it here live and is seeing this recording now for the first time, hello, thank you. You're very important to this community too. And please send us your questions if you didn't see them answered. And I really appreciate everyone for tuning into this Living with Lions webinar. We have members in all 50 states and around the world. We're funded by you, by individuals who care about mountain lions. Little known fact, we are actually mostly not grant funded. We are not federally grant funded. So good news, we're not going to lose federal grant funding. Bad news, we are funded by you. So thank you so much for that. But if you're not already supporting our work, you can become a member at mountainlion.org. And on our website, you can also learn more about these amazing animals, find out how you can advocate for them in your community, and see links for our upcoming webinars as well too. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a fantastic rest of your day.